So better save. So that's my main work terrain, and I now want to add Vegetation Studio. So add Vegetation Studio to see. I'm just checking that I'm not doing anything stupid. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so there it is. The first thing it'll complain of is we don't have a package, so I like to keep my packages in one place. So create, it's right down the bottom so you can't see it, but it's Vegetation Studio. And well, actually I remember from the previous video there is a way for me to, so I ended up moving that to let you see it, which is create, was it up here, component, create, no, assets, create, Awesome Technologies, vegetation package. And don't think I did this time. Last time I think I picked no textures last time because I was using CTS, but in this case I'm just using the bog standard texture. So it's 4 terrains I'm going to use because I have 4 terrains on my splat map, and here's that 8, 12, 16 multiple that I was talking about previously. So I'm going to do a 4 terrain. Now I remember this being a problem last time, so okay, so here's, I've added that and it's just not picked them up immediately. Of course, because I'm still adding new, but there's a way to kind of pick them up from the terrain, which I botched when I tested this before. So well, if I do it again you'll see the workaround, which is fine. So what am I going to call it? I'm going to call it meadow test. It's actually my second test, this one, so meadow test 2. So just to be clear, because these assets, it's not clear what they are, so it's Veg Studio package. This contains all of the information about the textures, so, and the foliage, you know, trees, all those things. So terrain textures, yeah, that's the bit that for some reason it doesn't automatically pick up. I can't remember. I clicked on this last time, update terrain on any, and it just kind of wiped what was on my. So I think I just have to bite the bullet and add them manually, and it's a pain. Here's another reason why having that additional inspector becomes handy. So I'm just going to lock the vegetation system, then I'm going to click on my terrain, so edit texture, and it is 4 and 4, and it's meadow soil. And then cancel that, edit is 4 and 4, meadow grass. So the order is important because you get an index at index 0, 1, 2, 3. Done. Edit, it is 4 and 4 again. Forest leaves. And finally, so that was a 20. So I've now got my textures. You can name it if you're using more than one, but you know, meadow 2, So the water level in Gaia is 50 by default, and we're going to need it for our little lake down there, so it's important to have that. I haven't got a wind zone yet. It could add one later. For now it's fine. Yes, in vegetation, global settings, this is where you kind of can tweak your view, your distance of how far you're going to see the grass, for example, and under the trees stop being meshes and become billboards, that kind of thing. Also really helpful, which we'll deal with in a little bit, is setting the density just globally of things like grass, plants, trees, and also scale, which is really useful. But for now we're just going to stick with just adding vegetation. So you get a choice if you can add 2D, which doesn't work so well in VR, or these 3D prefabs. Now even if you add a 2D texture, Vegetation Studio does create a simple kind of cross mesh for you, so it doesn't look as bad as just a flat billboarded 2D grass texture, but it's still not quite as good. So thankfully I've got my nature manufacture assets, and if I go down, let's have a look at some grass. So we're not dealing with the Unity terrain, so we're not actually bringing those in. We actually want the, actually what I need again is that so I can see them better. You can obviously just make them bigger here, but it's not quite the same, I find. So the cross patches, that's the one that is a kind of a more volumetric 3D, you know, of the grass patches. Okay, so I think at this stage it's probably start having to think about, I talked about optimize at every stage. So we optimized by making sure that the terrain wasn't super high resolution. Once you start adding these in, the number of vegetation items does have an impact, because if you think about it, every time you're loading, we're going to cut this into tiles, and each tile is going to have an instance of a vegetation package baked, but it still has to load the instances of all these prefabs. So just, yeah, it's lovely to have 20 more items of foliage here, but just be mindful that you can overload the amount of data that the async scene load in Unity can actually cope with, and that's when you get those lags, because it's spiking. It can't just download and initialize all these assets, or can't load into memory and initialize all these assets at once. So just be mindful of that. So that said, let's drag in some grass. So I just know that these are cope with being instance indirect, which is preferable. So there is a warning, it's telling you, the shader needs to support it. But that's, as I mentioned at the start, that's the beauty of using these packages from Nature Manufacture. So I can instance indirect, which will make things a bit lighter. Now, probably at this stage it helps, so we're not seeing anything. It's in there, but because we're so high, so it's probably worth going back and going, right, create player, water, screenshotter would be the traditional route, but I'm not going to use the default water. I don't really need the screenshotter in the player. Actually, it's just a first person. Where does that live? Standard asset. Yeah, it's just one of these. So I'm just going to drag my own and see where we've ended up. Yeah, I'll do. Why not? just to show you what I'm doing. So player and main camera here. The thing at various stages Gaia requires that player. Certainly if you're doing Enviro, it's looking for the player tag, and I've removed the audio clip. So something we'll get to when we get to more optimization is how can I explain this? It took me ages to work it out. So as an async scene load event occurs in Unity, so as a scene that contains a terrain tile loads, it's also triggering a load of any resources in the package. So anything that's in a folder, which is one of those special folders, these resource folders, gets loaded, and sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a package that you've included. So this is, yeah, there's not much I can do about that. That's part of actually in fact that one is part of the asset that we'll be using in order to hunt down these additional resources. They get packed into your asset, and they get loaded, and some are tiny ones, like just I think this is just part of the editor banners that you see in Vegetation Studio, but others are, you know, maybe shaders, large textures, things that do take up memory and system resources to load. So just be, I guess remember thinking about the fact that anything that's in a resource folder is loaded every time there's an async scene load. So that's the reason why I went through the inspector and removed these audio clips that are usually defaulted, and not only that, but I applied it to the prefab. So if you bring in this prefab, then remove them off your instance in the scene, it's still going to load the sounds, because it knows the prefab has them. So as you're altering prefabs, make sure that you apply if you really don't need the sound, otherwise those sounds do end up being loaded. Might be at some stage I can show you that, bring them back, and you'll see them appearing in the build. Might be an idea to do that. Use field of view kick, not that bothered, and I've already turned off head bobs. I've actually turned off and applied most of the settings that I usually do. That's great. Okay, something else I want to add, thinking of first person, what is it called? Advanced FPS counter. So that's just it's a bit like Graphy, if you know Graphy. Let me see if I've got it up here. No, oh yeah. Just won a Unity award. It's free, brilliant. Real time kind of a frames memory counter utility. So for monitor, for in-game, really useful. I just happen to use Advanced FPS just because I've been using it for a bit longer, but it does essentially the same thing. So the kind of things it does, it can display memory and device information. I actually just want the basics, and I want it to appear on the screen lower center. So that just helps you keep track of things as they run. So 50 plus, we're laughing, then it starts to become a problem. Something worth bringing up at this stage would be like project settings. So I mentioned that before. You need to be using I would recommend, definitely, who's to say, but I would recommend using linear. Let's see. So open our build settings, player settings. So you want to be using linear color space. So this is in player settings. It just, unless you're using mobile, not mobile, unless you mobile, which most devices don't support it. So for mobile you would set to gamma, but otherwise just go with linear and do that first thing. I guess I really should have said that right from the off. That's the first thing, because if I change it now it will have to read through all the assets again. I mean, it won't take forever, but if it's not necessary, it's not necessary. So yeah, color space linear, and then in project settings you've got graphics and quality settings that you can change. Change your vsync count to don't sync. So I do it for all of them, and the reason for that is you'll get a true representation of your frame rate. I'm no expert on vsync, and I'm not 100% sure actually what you ever want it on, because it's best to have your game run as the maximum sync or frames per second that it can. So vsync will sync to your monitor's sync, and a lot of people, even if they have a fast 144 hertz monitor, they've got it set to 60, and then so they're essentially capping the refresh rate of their game to 60. And when you're looking at the profiler, which we'll do kind of in the optimization section of this, you'll notice that you end up with this kind of weight buffer, because if it's set with vsync on, it'll essentially waste time until the next cycle, and that can bring in some problems. So set it to don't sync on all of these. If you can afford to, just reduce these settings a little bit, have a look at what, for example, medium is, and go closer to it. If you're doing VR, I mean, it's a whole new story again, and you probably be wanting just to use one single setting and just make it quite low. But for now, I think the main thing I would say is don't set it to vsync. And yeah, the anti-aliasing is probably worth, make sure that it's turned on. And finally, in graphics, set it to deferred on all the tiers, unless you're in VR, and then there's a lot to be said for being in forward rendering. But there's notes about that in the notes that I'll post in the description, so maybe read up on that, on the pros and cons of both. So we've got that, and we're kind of closer in, so we can now see our grass. And I mentioned in the vegetation global, this vegetation distance, so we're now at 100. If I set it to 200, see it kind of goes off a bit further off into the distance. Well, yeah, I'll go, why not? So I've got a patch of grass, just going to add some more grass for variation. So that's the one. But something else I want to do. So by default, the kind of this, because I've dropped it into the way Vegetation Studio works, it's dropped it into this grass slot, so it'll kind of set things up in a way that is useful for grass. It kind of makes sense, but it won't do everything. So it won't do these terrain texture rules, for example. So I want to exclude, add an item, and I want it to exclude. So 4 is the slot that has our rock. Definitely don't want any grass on rock. And I also probably don't want any grass on, is it 3? Yeah, which is the one that is the leaves, so it's the forest leaves, because I just want to keep that clean of grass. That's fine. So let's look for some more. I'm just going to copy that item, because I might just copy it later. Which one did I pick originally? So it was 2. Bring in 3. So yeah, make sure you're on grass. So I'm going to paste the values, and on the Perlin noise, if you invert it, it's kind of saying where there is one, don't have the other. The patch, then you can kind of see it. Where is it? Show heat map. Oh, actually, it's not the heat map. Is there. I'm just going to have grass everywhere. That's not so helpful for that one. But one thing I do want to try and do is, so I don't like the way they're much bigger, those ones. I'm going to go 1 and 6, so it just fits in a little more. And then I think I'd like to have one that's just a little bit maybe, so I talked about, you know, trying to not have too much foliage, but grass, there you are. Something else to bear in mind for optimization, so these are loaded, great. Which one am I on? This one, okay. Select each of the loads, make that a bit smaller. Make sure your shadows are off. We'll be adding shadows, so I'm going to refresh the prefab. We'll be adding shadows using screen space effects. Shadows are very performance, very heavy on in Unity generally. If you can afford not to use shadows, don't. And on small items like grass, I would recommend not, and use the screen space effect. The other things are particle systems. So if you're using you know, environmental particle systems that are really nice, you know, whether it's butterflies or whatever, leaves, don't set them to pre-warm, because as each tile loads up it has to pre-warm and then play the scene. So for streaming, set your environmental particle systems to not pre-warm. That's another little thing. I'm just double checking the they're all set to, so off, refresh. Should really have set that before. And this one off. Okay. What have I got? So on this one, paste the values as well. So I've gained, or actually no, what it's done is it's doubled up those. So delete. Not sure why it did that. Maybe because I pasted on. Oh yeah, when you add them, it adds at the start, not at the end. It gets me every time. So that was our very first one. That was the one that we added. Double check the noise. So that's unticked. And that is ticked. And we got that. That's the new one. So that's the one that I meant to do a paste values on. And just want to change that a little bit. Quite a lot of this one, but maybe not quite that much. Something really nice about Vegetation Studio, the way that it I think the scale is a bit wrong. It kind of shows things on the fly. Right, so we've got quite a lot of grass, it seems. Maybe we need some flowers. So we've done grass. Is it in details? No. So bring that back in so you can see it. So I like these cross ones just because they fill things out a little bit more, but you don't always have to. It's quite nice, that one. So this one goes in plants, and it's the annoying bit of having a smaller screen while screencasting. So the scale looks fine, but we definitely need to add some of those. So actually, yeah, so the other way of doing it, the way that I did an exclude on the rock, the other way is just, it must be on this one, so that's the only include that it's gonna, the only one that's gonna be in. 2 is the grass, so now that one is definitely set to only be on the grass. We can go back after we've had a walk around our environment, we can change these to make sure we've got things as we want. That's quite Berlin noise. So Berlin noise, the other kinds of patches. That's a bit better. I want just little patches here and there. You can see those I'm changing. Not bad. That's actually probably a little bit too much, but that'll do. So that's a good one. The only thing I didn't do, it was chamomile that I brought in, wasn't it? Let's check. This was off. Copy selected item. Let's bring in another. What have we got? We got white. I mean, the classic would be the poppy, wouldn't it? See poppies everywhere though. Okay. Go with that. Drop it in the plants and paste value, and you can see, so right on top of each other, they're exactly the same because they're using the same seed and the same settings. So inverse Berlin noise, and now you've got patches in other areas. I might reduce their density a bit. But not quite that much. Yeah. And just add one more. I want something quite light ideally. Not quite what I want. Maybe more. So half the, it's not battle, half the fun is just picking these the right. That's pretty good. That will fill things out. and it's the kind of meadow. So turn those off, and whether that counts as grass or plant is hard to tell, but I'm just going to go with plant, partly because I want to paste values, on that one, and then do that Perlin noise invert again and get these patches. That's kind of what I was hoping for. Move that out of the way. And the density is a bit less because of they themselves were quite dense, I think, from memory. And we got a bulb patch there, so we need to investigate that, because we've got our grass is just not growing. That's to do with this, so there must be an element of both of these and not on there. So I think what I've done is I've just should really, let me see, I've used exclude, I should use include instead. Must be on here. I'm going to certainly delete that one. Yeah, that's better. And I'm going to do that. Also, I've done that on the first grass. Do that on the other grass. Include. We definitely want it on grass. Delete that one. Looking better. And then the final one, include texture 2, which is our grass, and then delete that one. That's the one I think that's being kind of slightly painted. Okay. I'm not sure about this, to be honest. Feels a little bit too different, too light. Is there another one that was similar? Yeah, I think that's more subtle, except that I forgot to change its okay. I think it's time to have a walk around. Save that. So we're in the, I've got quite a fast thing going on. Not sure about those, that grass. I feel very low. What's going on? What's the height of this character control? No, it is a height of 1.8. Smoke and mirrors. It's not quite right if I was, but for now that'll do. I just kind of want to get to a point where we can start chunking this terrain. The only one that's not really working for me is this very thin grass. So let me stop that. Anyway, so start that. Vegetation. This one, not super happy with that. Let's find something else that we can replace it with. So the replacement, because I've not made it clear enough, is, so I'm locked. Off. This is literally, you drop it into the vegetation prefab. Done. Refresh prefab is more for if you then make a change on the prefab, like when I've been altering, say, the lighting settings. Prefab's been done, but you need to refresh it so that Vegetation Studio reloads it essentially and takes in all the bits and pieces. So something I've noticed, which I did on the first one but not on the others, I don't think, or certainly not on that one, is set things to instance in direct. Make the most of it where you can. And something else which I mentioned, oh, and another nice feature of Vegetation Studio. So we're walking around, great. These settings that I mentioned, so global grass density. It's just not cutting it for you. Tweak settings here. Okay, looking good. So there you see these areas that we defined as do not place anything here. Time to place some stuff. And the reason I made these patches, there for example, is so that I could use the same terrain map, include rules, but with trees. So back in the meadow package, trees. So in certain resources you'll notice that there are VS prefabs. They're set up specifically so that they work in Vegetation Studio. Do use those instead of the other ones. Let me move that across so you can see it. So they've got some kind of young saplings and then smaller trees going up towards bigger ones. For the trees I'm going to leave the shadows on. So large objects, rocks, trees, keep default Unity shadows. Is, you kind of bite the bullet. They need it, they look natural, but very small grass, flowers, you don't want that on. So I'm going to have some young trees, and you can see they're kind of turned up everywhere. But I'm going to say I need a rule. I just want to just be on texture 3 it was, wasn't it? And you can set the kind of the density of the placement. So there's a little bit of that brown dotted around. So our trees are kind of ended up in those places. So what I want is just be a little bit more selective, and all of a sudden now you can see how actually only, hopefully that made sense. If that was set to the original, oh sorry, it's it's a slider with a slider. So the original would have been kind of like that. So they're kind of everywhere. There's been this little bit of brown texture, but if you want to tighten it up, close that in. These are the young saplings. I want it to be fairly loose. So I want them on the kind of the outside. Happy with that. Got a copy selected, and I'm going to then add which one? Slightly bigger tree. Let's go with 4. Yeah, I'm on tree. So immediately it's ended up everywhere. But I'm going to say, oh, actually, I copied it, nice. I can paste value. Now there's some stuff up there, some trees up in the. Do I want that? Possibly, possibly not. We tighten that up even more. So I really want them to be only in the middle. I think I'm going to use a height. So use height level, yes. I don't want them to be any higher than. Let's try that. Let's see if they disappear. No. Interesting. They seem to be disappearing from here. I'm doing the opposite of what I'm intended to. So it's allowed from min 0 to max. Oh, but actually it might be that the ones that we're seeing up there are from the other tree. Height to 70. Yeah, that's what it was. So they're kind of saying, yeah, so they're dying in the foothills. That's kind of what I want to see. So 0 to 70. 0 to 70, you've done the same, that's fine. And that's the big trees. Just a bit denser maybe. And I'm gonna copy selected. So something worthwhile with trees when you're using Vegetation Studio is to use collision detection. That's the placement. That's not saying add colliders. We've not added colliders. That would be in here. So you would say do add a capsule or a sphere collider if you want collision enabled. So obviously that has an overhead. You can add it. It would just actually probably shouldn't we? Well, no, I'll leave it not, and then we can go back and add it if we decide it's super important. But that's where you would add your colliders. But in terms of collision detection, that's just saying, as I'm placing the tree, am I going to look to see whether I'm colliding with one of the other existing trees? So that's okay. Copy selected. What's that one? That's a 4. That's a 1. Maybe add a 2, like a smaller. Additional tree. And I select that, copy selected. That's the new one I've added. 1. 2, no, that's the new one I've added. So paste values. Alright, that's kind of doing what I expected to do, and it's got this kind of idea of, it's actually looking at, I'm going to save. Okay, so walking around, got a few dotted trees. I mean, you can start adding rocks, looking good. We haven't got our water yet. We should add the water. So something to bear in mind is we're dealing with very long sight lines. So one of the things that Firewatch does really well, and they talk about it in their video, is this idea of just managing what the viewer sees. The problem with a long sight line is the fact that the grass obviously stops. So I mean, I guess you can have more hills would be one way to do it, have a forest of trees that would stop the view, just create your environment. I mean, we created something that's super flat. If you remember our, it's essentially a big basin that's surrounded by mountains. So it's kind of a tricky, we're not really seeing the mountains because of see that the way the mountain climbs and disappears. That's the camera's clipping plane. Still clipping over there. So it's gonna have to be 3000. It looks like, and you can see that's, I mean, that's how we've got a 4K terrain. So yeah, so it's a long way away. And so how do you deal with the fact that your grass is really only going to travel so far? What we'll do is we stream it. We'll have terrains close to the player with all this lovely grass, and then in the distance it will be replaced by a mesh rather than an expensive Unity terrain. So you'll definitely not have any grass on there. So there are a few workarounds. The easiest workaround is Vegetation Studio Pro has a kind of a way of essentially creating a texture which includes the vegetation, and then you lay that instead of the default splat map. And I'm told, I've not tried it, but I'm told a microsplat does something similar. But I don't want to get lost down implementing microsplat quite yet. But so just to be aware that that's a possibility. For now, I'm just going to bite the bullet and say, well, it's there. You know some of the ways of working around it. I mean, the best way is to design an environment that isn't quite so ridiculously wide open. It's kind of asking for trouble. But I mean, it's not bad. We can tweak things as we go. Try to see if we can get away with slightly longer sight lines for the grass. It looks nice when there's at least a little bit of a slope that you can kind of imagine somewhere in the distance there's something there. And I guess a classic workaround is you just make sure that the colour of your foliage matches certainly the distance colour of your textures. So you can just slightly darken them, I guess, would be one way to go about it. But it's not too bad. Let me actually make sure that that's what we need it to be. Done. So I think we've got something that is workable and can get us to the next stage, because you can see I'm running into 2 hours. That's quite a lot just to set up essentially terrain with map, splat map, kind of then Vegetation Studio. We're not going to need Gaia again, but we're in our work scene, which is fine. Some vegetation items based on the textures. So pretty much the basics, what you might have. Semi-tempted to add some rocks and some additional details, but it's this balance of the number of assets that you include is going to alter the way that your terrain is going to load, or your terrain tiles are going to stream and load. So something that we should do first, having saved the scene here we have, is actually build. So something else to bear in mind. Delete, add open scene. You really only get a true idea of performance, especially with streaming, but also just a normal scene when you're trying a build out. And the reason for that is obviously there's an editor overhead. All of these inspectors, multiple inspector windows, all these things have an impact. So have builds, profile of the build. I tend to, for quite a lot of my development, I just have these development builds that auto connect to the profiler, so I can actually look at it in the profiler. So where are we? This is where I want to be. Yep. And I'm going to call that, so base window to terrain. Actually, base meaning not chunked. So we'll let it do its magic, and that will give us our kind of base. Okay, so what are we dealing with? And at the start I talked about the advice that Recon had given me on the Discords, which was to don't add the foliage, just do just your texture. So we can do that. We just happen to have a kind of a starting block now. Kind of we've got our terrain, we've got Vegetation Studio, we've got a vegetation system package that's got all the foliage that we want to include, but we can now start backtracking, removing that. Let's chunk things into tiles. Let's create a level of detail, terrain meshes. Essentially, beyond a certain distance, don't have expensive Unity terrain, but replace them with a mesh. Okay, so that's asking me whether I want it to connect to the profiler. Yeah, I do, when it's time. What resolution are we? Yeah, that should be fine. Window, definitely. Oh, actually no, it's not fine. It's a bit too big for the screen capture. Cancel. And we're not seeing any grass. So why are we not seeing any grass? Let's work on that while we're at it. Move that out of the way. So we've lost our grass. I've done something as part of my where did that come from? So that probably confused Vegetation Studio, which has a frustum culling feature, so it probably got confused by the additional camera. No idea why or how. Probably we'll find out when I re-watch this. Okay, so it's build. Yeah, I'm happy to it's doing its magic. There's a lot of patience involved in terms of building, rebuilding, running. So what did I say? So it's 1280. That's more what we need, just simply because of the screen. So provided is not valid stamp, you need to try the stamp preview from one of the directories. Gaia stamps directory. Okay, well I'm gonna get rid of, that's an interesting warning error to do with the Gaia stamper, and I definitely will be deleting Gaia from our final. It's clear. Okay, so we're doing pretty well actually. You know, you're kind of dealing with. And this is where Vegetation Studio is kind of does its magic. It's a big terrain. We've got, I guess, a decent amount of grass. Not mega. You could definitely add some more. But you're on a powerful PC. Let's I'll admit it. It's kind of just doing a decent job of playing just the whole thing at about, I guess, 280. Yeah, I mean, I've not done the best job with the terrain textures, because really I wouldn't want any grass on top of that brown. It's a really, when there isn't an additional texture on top, it's a really nice kind of grass forest feel that you get. But hey, you get the feel for what might be possible. So, but anyway, so we're at kind of 283, and it's coping, but you know, it's only a 4K terrain. We kind of talked about it being potentially 8K or even kind of an infinite terrain that would keep rolling and rolling. So I think, and also possibly because I'm at a small resolution, let's see how it handles it at what I would expect it on my PC. So play. I'll have to tell you what it gives because you're not going to be able to see it. Actually, doing perfectly well, but that's it. It is a powerful PC, and we haven't got any post-processing effects, anything else. And we haven't got our water as well. That's the other bit that I've forgotten to add yet. So let's get rid of Guy because that was a problem. And I'm going to save the scene as work scene. And there's a reason for that. That's where we're going to be adding all our bits and pieces. I think I've got Aquis already installed. Maybe not. No. Let's add Aquis. Just waiting for the window to catch up. Yeah. Once imported, you can use the Gaia integration. It's not entirely needed, to be honest. Aquis does a pretty decent job of setting things up for you in a similar way. So do I want all of that? Kind of. I don't need the demo, partly because I don't want it to bring in all these additional things. I'll just say yes to the rest. I don't think so. It's worth always having a look to see whether or not there's an asset that's being reused by another asset. So rather than showing new, it'll have a little in use icon or about to be updated icon. In that case, just be aware, you're going to possibly overwrite it, but there's this whole new, so I'm going to say, yeah, that's good. Import. once I've done the water, the next bit, I guess apart from say a basic post-processing effects, is to actually do the chunking, so get to the core of what I want to do. So 2 hours in, we've got our basic terrain ready to start chunking. Let's go Aquas, quick setup. This is the window it's showing me, so it's asking for a couple of things, which is what's your terrain and what's your camera. After that you've got this choice of, okay, so what kind of quality. For the water I'm going to stick with web and console. Clear lake is good. This is going to be a lake. I'm just going to add the water. I'm not going to bother with underwater effects. So that's that done, except for a couple of things. So, and things that, this is the bit that Gaia integrates for you, is the height. It knows that it should be at 50, whereas this water plane is not. So I can set that to 50. The other part is, and Gaia does the same, is it sets it to the size of the terrain. It's kind of expecting the whole thing to be waterbound, but I definitely don't need that. I just need something which is just big enough to cover my lake. I make it a little bit higher than the 50. So that bit, and something that you might not see immediately is these boxes. Now they come from these caustic projectors. They have essentially a size which is set to the size that it would expect for that large terrain, but we don't need it to be that big. In fact, go 300. Yeah, that seems fine. So you don't want the caustics to be visible. Outside of where it actually is. So no, yeah, more 53. Okay, it's gonna, let's have a look down there, see how it feels. So I definitely would recommend adding, you know, meshes of forest, of rocks and additional. So I'm gonna have to tweak. You can see how the grass is just a little bit. So something I guess I haven't made explicitly clear. See the cutoff. It's hard by being in play view just to, that's it. Is as we're tweaking all these things, adding all of our textures, as is all our plants, we're essentially changing the data inside this package, and we're going to use this package when we tile and stream the terrain tiles as being, this is where vegetation lives. So that's why it's kind of important to kind of get the broad strokes right at this stage. And so the main issue actually is in settings is this height. Let me make the height say 54, which has freaked it out a little bit. Hopefully we get, okay, so that's gone maybe too far. 53. So it's somewhere in between. Okay, that kind of makes sense. It is an exact number. If you wanted it to be absolute, you could, 54. That's the magic number. Okay, I'm just gonna raise it up just a little bit. I think it's worth having a kind of a, and you probably would want to ease that transition, to be honest, but hey, for now. And Vegetation Studio Pro has such amazing biome maps and masks that make this kind of, especially from one to the other, so much easier. But we're dealing with the broad strokes and the basics here, and I just want to show you the principles of what needs to be thought about and how you might go about solving these problems. So a good thing about Vegetation Studio is because you're actually saving to this package, so the settings are remembered. I was going to say are remembered, but actually in this case they haven't. It seems that it remembers some settings. If you change these around here, it seems to change it, and sometimes, actually I was going to make that a bit more, wasn't I? Let's try again. I expected that to remember it, but it didn't, so I'm going to go. Yeah, I'm going to make it work a little bit harder, I think, because if it's got this starting to feel a bit more lush, I'm going to make it cool. That's better. So what am I at? 134, 1.2. Fine. So save my work scene. Got Aquas. I did talk about getting post-processing effect, but I'll do that right at the end and we'll see what we can get away with. So I've got a tiled terrain. So I've got a single terrain, and we're now about to tile it. We're going to do two things. We're going to create a mesh of it, and we're going to create tiles. Okay, something I would do at this stage. By default, these get called, essentially it's the date and the time. That's the timestamp, and it gets saved in the root of your assets. There it is. So I'm actually going to call that something that is meaningful to me. So what did we make? We made a 4K test. And in here I'm going to say the same thing. Terrain 4K test. And you'll thank me for that later, because as we're creating our chunks, it's going to use the names both of the game object but also of the terrain data, and not having those additional numbers and weird timestamp thing just makes the assets that you're dealing with much easier to handle. So another save. Now I'm going to go file save scene as chunked. And while I'm here, I'm going to make use of shelf. I'm just going to go around. That's our work scene. That's the main one. That's it chunked. And move it out of this because it's not needed. and actually do we need it now? No, because we'll bring that back in and you'll see why. Advanced FPS, we're not really going to be using it. This is like a work scene in the same way. It's not going to be the game, and you definitely don't need the water. It's just literally somewhere that we need to be working on our terrain and doing a couple of things to it. First things first, double check this issue of trees so there's no objects defined on it, because it is a pain if you've got them. Okay, done. Now something, I'm just going to stop the recording and then restart it, just because I've been running for 2 hours 15. The software I'm using, I don't know if it's just going to fall over when I, if the file becomes so big. So let's do that now before I get to the next bit, which is the actual chunking, which in itself is a different part of the process.